conversation, and I'll explain to you how we wrote this book and why we wrote it. And about 10 years ago, my father attended a class reunion in Strandquist, Minnesota, which is way up in the northwestern corner of the state. And it was the first teaching job he ever had. And he went back for a 50th class reunion. And he came home and he said, Jill, all of these little towns will be gone in 10 years. Everything that I remember in Strandquist is gone. And so Deane and I thought, well, let's find out if this is true. We'll travel around the state of Minnesota, find the 100 smallest towns, and write about them. So of course, everybody, the first question we get is, why isn't my town in the book? The towns had to be around 100 people, and they had to be incorporated. So they had to have a mayor and a council. And out of that little Minnesota town book, we discovered all these men who had died in World War II. 165 men died from the 100 smallest towns, and we wrote the stories of 140 men. There were another 25 that died in accidents or illness, and they're also listed in the book, but we didn't tell their stories. And by the way, I'm Jill Johnson, my husband Deane. Thank you for having us here. We're delighted to be in Marshall. We heard a lot about the library from the other libraries that we've been to. They all said, wait till you get to Marshall. They've got the greatest library.
Yeah.
We really do have a beautiful library.
They have an actual projection system.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. We have a lot of sources to get our information. And to begin with, Jill spent a lot of time with the National Archives in St. Louis, and they would send her files on these guys, which used to be classified, but now files on servicemen that have died in war have been declassified so you can obtain them. And we got a lot of information from other history sites, like the Center of Military History in the Army, which is online. The Naval Archives were also very helpful. And we would go online and find places like the 12th Bomb Group would have a museum site. And so from all of these different spots, we were able to get some of the basic information.
And I think we found that the military people were the most helpful people in the world. If you wanted to know something and you contacted their group, if they didn't know it, they would find somebody that did. And of course, the families were amazing. They went up in the attics, dug around in old trunks and boxes, and kind of rediscovered a lost relative. They would send us photos and poems and letters, and it was quite remarkable for them also to go on this journey of finding someone that has been gone for a very long time. We didn't have any women that died from the tiny towns, or women that served but didn't die. But we did find Hazel Thompson from Strandquist, and she was the first woman from Minnesota to serve in the Women's Army Air Corps. And I talked to her daughter, and she said that the day her mom went in to enlist, she didn't weigh enough, so she didn't make the cut. So she went home, she ate 3 bananas, and drank several glasses of water, went back in, and she weighed enough, so she made the cut.
We're going to take you across the state, different parts of the state, and different times in the war, and it's mostly chronological order. Most of the men that we're talking about today from southern Minnesota and then other places were involved in the European theater of operations. So it's going to focus on that, although in our book we had a lot of guys that served in the Pacific and were involved in all of the major battles in the Pacific.
So we'll share the stories with you of about 10 men, and then maybe a little bit about the town that they grew up in.
We're going to start it in Pearly, Minnesota, which is also in a wonderful agricultural land. Has anybody ever been to Pearly? Do you know where it is even? It's up in Norman County, which is just north of Fargo-Moorhead area. So it's in the Red River Valley. So right now they're looking at dealing with some flooding coming up pretty soon in Pearly.
Pearly lost 8 men in World War II, a town of 100 people. So you can imagine the impact that that would have on a small town. And Gunner's Mate 3C, John Emery, was in the Navy, and he had the unfortunate, he was unfortunately on the USS Arizona on December 7th. And this is the ship he was on.
And there's what it looked like on December 7th. Has anyone been to the Arizona Memorial in Honolulu? It's quite an amazing place. They have a beautiful memorial set up right over the Arizona, which still sits as it was. And then inside they have tablets of the men that died. There were 2 J.M. Emrys, as it turned out, not related. You can still see oil slicks bubbling up from the gun turrets. They call that the tears of the Arizona. So it's all still right there underwater.
Something that we discovered when we researched the book is that survivors of the USS Arizona now choose to be buried with their team, with their fellow sailors. And so here you have a diver taking the ashes from one of the survivors down into the number 4 gun turret to be buried with his fellow sailors.
We're going to jump ahead a little bit because Jack had a brother, Carl, who also died in World War II, 3 days after D-Day.
We had 3 families in the book that lost 2 sons, and the Emrys were one of them. Carl's boat was crossing the English Channel just a few days after D-Day and was struck by a German U-boat, torpedoed by a German U-boat. And so that's the ordnance ship that he was on.
It carried heavy equipment across the channel. They were reinforcing after the invasion when it happened.
And so we talked to their niece, Carol Halverson, and this is what she had to say. She said it's something they never got over. She's talking about the family. You can't help but think how the family dynamics changed with those deaths, and how different things might have been had they not been killed. There were 2,403 people killed at Pearl Harbor, which means our family story is the story of 2,402 other families.
We're going to bring you closer to home.
Do you know where Dover is? Anybody been there? Yeah?
Yeah, so that's down in Murray County.
You know, in northern Minnesota, nobody knows where any of these towns are, so it's kind of fun here.
Totally lost.
Aaron Johnson was in the Navy, served on the USS Houston, and was in the Battle of the Flores Sea in the Dutch East Indies. His niece sent these photos, and I love the photo of Aaron with his nephew. He brought him a sailor suit home on leave, and I just thought that was so cute. Just love it.
Here's a quote from a Navy memo back in 1919 where it says, "The boy from the farm is considered by the Naval Recruiting Service to be the most desirable material." Any idea why that would be? They do it, they're told?
Yes.
Yeah, they're disciplined.
What else? Why would a farm boy be so valuable to the military?
We're in pretty good shape.
Yeah.
Good shape.
Good physical condition.
Know how to fix stuff.
That is,
There you go.
that's one of the main things.
That
I
was
gave a talk in Strength List, and one of the guys came in and said, "Yeah, I was in the Army, and we had this tank that wasn't working. I looked at the carburetor," and he said, "You know, that looks just like a cream separator back home." He said, "I had it fixed in no time." Yeah, you have to be able to fix equipment on the fly when you're on a. Today they'd be able to program a computer.
They could also typically shoot a gun and were comfortable in the woods. So they just had everything that the military desired. President Roosevelt's favorite ship was the USS Houston, the ship that Aaron Johnson served on. And so Aaron sent a letter home and he said, I can say I've been fishing with the Prez. He's a real guy. He can't walk, but he's always happy. And it was interesting how all the families, they dealt with their grief differently. And Aaron's mother, the way she dealt with her sadness is she made all these button plates. She would take buttons off pants, shirts, wedding dresses, anything. And she made 23 button plates. And this is a real treasure for the family, and they have kept them to this day.
We're going to move a little bit north again to Burbank in Otter Tail County.
Anybody been to Burbank?
Yeah,
I've been through there.
You have?
you're the first one in
First
southern
one.
Minnesota that has been there.
Parents lived up in Deer Creek, and then they went over to Otter Tail late in the age. We
Yeah.
saw
Yeah.
Burbank, he's been through it.
Yeah. There was somebody here from Purim, they're right about in here, and they hadn't even been there. Frank Deane was from Burbank, and he was in the 7th Infantry Division. He fought in the only battle that was fought on American soil. Anybody
Alaska.
care? Yeah, it was
Yes.
Alaska.
Yes.
Exactly. It was on the island of Attu, which, if you look at it, that's almost closer to Japan than it is to the mainland over there. So the Japanese invaded that early on. They had been there for at least a year. And Frank and his regiment trained in the Mojave Desert. And their first assignment was here. Can you imagine?
One of the people that attended one of the sessions said that her uncle also had served on Attu. And that he had sent a letter home and said, we were so unprepared for the weather, for the terrain, for the tundra. We didn't have the right boots, the right clothing. It was a...
Here's the guys setting up some machine guns or something and getting ready. And you can tell they've got fairly light jackets on. I don't know. I guess it pays to be young, for one thing. They landed on Attu. The Japanese force was concentrated in here, and they had two landing groups. Frank's came in an area, and they got blown a little off, and they ended up landing in Massacre Bay. Sounds a little ominous, doesn't it? They were able to push the Japanese back to Chicago Harbor, and there they made a very determined last stand. And I don't know if they had a bonsai charge, but things got rough, and it ended up in hand-to-hand combat at that point.
You know, the military history was so important to us when we did the research and the after-action reports, and that all was a big piece of our research. But for me, the most important piece of the work was the family history, what the families would tell us, the things that we couldn't find in the government reports. And so I found Frank Deane's sister, Hildy, and she let us know, kind of gave us a glimpse into their family's life, what was going on, and what actually happened to Frank. So many times the military really didn't know what happened, but Hildy found out exactly what happened to Frank. And she said, most of our ancestors crossed the Atlantic Ocean from Germany and Poland to settle in Burbank, Minnesota. No one was prepared for the terrible drought, contagious illnesses, and the depression years of the 30s. When Dad had a stroke while down in the well looking for water and died in 1939, Frank left to find work in the Dakotas on a ranch. Everyone knew more trouble was coming. And each evening after supper, the family gathered around the battery radio to keep us informed. Frank was drafted into the Army. Everyone missed him. He was a likable man, quiet, soft-spoken, and never married. He never wanted to be in the spotlight and never wanted his picture taken. We were told that Frank and some other soldiers were in the barracks when a Japanese man wearing an American Army uniform came in and stabbed him with a bayonet. Many years later, when my mother was dying from cancer, I was sitting by her bedside, and suddenly she opened her sparkling blue eyes, smiled, and said, "Oh, Frankie, it's so good to see you." Her youngest son had finally come home. And that's not something I'm going to find in a government report. So it was really special to connect with family members and find out what was happening. Grab and share, there's plenty of room.
Thanks. We're going to go to another place where we were able to make a really special connection. And this is in Wright, which is in Carroll County. I doubt anybody's been there. I hadn't been there.
Boy, if you've been to Wright, you'll get a prize.
And so that's located right up by Cloquet and Duluth. They have a big top, which it's by their county park, and they have, or a city park, and they have it looks like it might be a beer garden because they have a festival called Wrong Days in Wright. During the festival, everything has to happen backwards. They have a softball tournament where they have to run the bases backwards. And it sounds like they have a wonderful time.
I think there might be some adult beverages involved.
Yeah.
I think so. So Peter Chernich he grew up in Wright, and he was in the Merchant Marine on the USS San Matilda. Something I did not know that you probably do know is that the Merchant Marine was not considered part of the military. That if you were in the Merchant Marine, you did not qualify for any military benefits at all. And I don't think this changed until 1980s. It was a long time.
Peter was in Bari, Italy, when he was killed, and the ship that he was on was unloading supplies for a hospital that they were building. And so they were in the harbor. They were supposed to have the lights off because there was regular nighttime raids by German bombers. But according to the stories, the British left the lights on. They always blame the British if something goes wrong. But anyway, he was in the bottom of the ship and didn't survive.
But we were delighted to meet his spouse, the only surviving spouse we found out of the 140 men that we wrote about. And Eileen Chernich, she was 100 when we interviewed her. She just died last October at 102. We had a delightful visit. I said, Eileen, you've got to tell me what happened. What was going on with you and Peter? Well, she said, we married during the Depression in 1937. We decided we wanted a big adventure. So we left Wright and drove to California to look for work. I wanted to be a maid and Peter wanted to be a chauffeur. So Jack Parr hired us. Then she said Edward G. Robinson hired us. And we had a great time in California. Peter decided that he wanted to be in the service, tried to get into the Navy, and they would not take him because he was colorblind. But the Merchant Marine would take him. And she said that his last letter to her, she had asked him what he wanted for Christmas. He said, I want a case of scotch. Well, it was wartime and she could only get a quart. So she wrapped it up and she said, I still have it to this day. Special lady. And the last survivor of the 1918 Great Fire in Hinckley. She was the last survivor.
We're going to go way north now. We're getting close to Canada. Has anyone ever been up to Strangquist or Carlsted? There used to be moose wandering through these towns.
You've been to Strangquist? Nobody's been to Strangquist.
It's way north. It's in the north end of Marshall, almost to Kitson County, on Highway 59, so it's connected. And it's the home of the white-tailed deer. That's their slogan. When we first came through there, they had a deer and a big sign that said that. And I went back to take a better picture of it for our little Minnesota 100 Towns book, and the deer was gone. And I walked into the post office, which was the only business in town open by then. And I said, what happened to your deer? So somebody stole it. It disappeared last month, and we haven't been able to find it, and they still haven't been able to find it. And she said, and they took the sign too. We don't know what happened.
So if you find this deer in a pawn shop somewhere, let us know,
So
will
if
you?
you're fishing on a lake up there and you see a deer on your sonar, you'll understand. So I came back, and she said, don't worry, we'll get another one. I came back, and there was a deer, and it was on a big concrete log, which itself is attached to a concrete block in the ground, and it was insured. But as far as we know, it's still there. And Strengthwest had 7.
They lost
men
7 men in
that
World
they
War
lost.
II, a town of 100.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
First of which was Walter Kostrowski on D-Day, and he was at Omaha Beach, and he was in the first wave at Omaha Beach.
And we have read that 90% of the first wave did not survive.
Of the divisions, first division came in Utah Beach, and the fourth came in Omaha, and then other countries came in on these other 5 beaches. It seemed hopeless. There was an element of surprise. I mean, Rommel was at his wife's birthday party in Germany when this all happened. This is, we were there a year ago with a Band of Brothers tour. Has anybody seen that HBO series, Band of Brothers?
Oh, you have.
It's
It's
quite
wonderful,
an
isn't it?
amazing story. This is a view from the top of Omaha Beach from the German gun emplacement. And you can see, first of all, it's a very beautiful day. There's somebody riding a horse out in the surf, and there's a kite surfer out there. But anyway, this is the view that they had at the beach. It was a very similar day. I think the tide was actually kind of similar. This is the view that the American servicemen had at Omaha Beach, coming out of those transports that often stopped in farther away from shore than this in deep water. This was taken by chief photographer's mate Robert F. Sargent, very famous picture.
I wanted to show you this because this was a critical piece of our research. This is the individual deceased personnel file, or the IDPF. They are held in the National Archives in St. Louis. This was all classified information and not available to the public until recently, but now you can get this information if you write to them. We had to have this for the book because you can see what it will tell you. It tells you their division, their regiment, their company, where they died, when they died, and often in some cases how they died. In the bottom it tells us when Walter died and then when his body was found. And then on the next page over you have the report of the burial, so you find out where they were buried when the body was moved. And so it was all just critical information we had for each man. What we didn't know until we got the IDPF was that the government saved every single letter that the families wrote to them. And so many of the files had family letters. And here, Walter's mother is writing to the government. What you learn from this is that English is not her first language. It's her. You know, she's from Poland, and so she's writing in very broken English. She's having somebody help her on this letter. This is in 1944, and she says, "Dear sir, can you please find out how my son, PFC Walter Kostrowski, met his death? Was there anything found of him? If there was anything founded of him, I would like to have it for remembrance. I'm broken-hearted mother, yours very truly, Rose Kostrowski." 4 years later, she's writing her own letter. And now the government has written to her and said, where do you want your son buried? Do you want him to stay in France, or do you want us to send the body back to Strandquist? And she writes, "Dear sir, let my loving son be where he is remains. He lost his life and blood there. God bless him, Rose Kostrowski." So these letters were just so poignant and so touching, and we were so pleased that the government saved every one of them.
And here's his grave in Normandy American Cemetery. And you can he's in the back side of the cemetery, and yet you can see lines and lines of.
Has anybody been over there? We went over last summer and then visited the graves of the men in the book and then put a rose on each grave and sent it to the families because most of the families had never been over there either.
Did anybody send the dead body back?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, many of them did. Mhm.
We had one guy repatriated just a year before the book came out, and we didn't even know he was from a little Minnesota town. I was on a fishing trip up north, picked up the Virginia and Minnesota paper, and there's an article on a guy named John Sersha whose body had just been ID'd in the missing tablets over there, but they ID'd his body and they were going to bring him back home. And I go, oh, Jill, he's from Leonidas. We don't have this guy. So, yeah.
But now with the DNA testing, they're able to identify a lot more of the men. And so you'll read, I think this part of the state too, there's been stories of men who have been identified and now sent back for burial.
On that same day, Ellsworth Unger, also from Strandquist, was killed crossing the English Channel on a C-47. He was in the 101st Airborne 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. And so he was a paratrooper. There's a picture of some paratroopers getting ready to jump. And that's a picture of Operation Market Garden.
He was the 101st Airborne, which was a very elite group of men who were trained to jump behind enemy lines. And the Band of Brothers movie was based on the 101st Airborne. And I had asked some people, why did these guys sign up to jump out of airplanes? Why did they want to be a paratrooper? $50 more a month if you would be a paratrooper. It's a lot of money back then.
When we were in northern France, just not far from Omaha Beach, there was a couple of churches there that had put in stained glass that commemorating the paratroopers. There's one jumping over this church, Angeville Planet. There's a Screaming Eagles logo and another stained glass window and some other Americana patriotism.
We're very touched by the French and their gratitude to the American people. To put stained glass windows in their churches commemorating our paratroopers was really quite remarkable.
Throughout Normandy. If you saw Band of Brothers, there's a church where the paratrooper got hung up on the cross for a while, and they were able to rescue him somehow. And this is a piece of stained glass in that church, which has two paratroopers on it coming back. So it's interesting how they did that.
Now we'll go to Revere. Has anybody been to Revere?
That can't be too far away, is it?
You've been there.
Yeah. Redwood County, yeah. Warren Parker is from Revere, and he's done a lot of fun stuff over there.
Yeah,
He says, putting in some of his pictures.
Built a little engine that could, and an old Sears buggy, and just does a lot of fun things. Fun guy to meet in Revere. So Sergeant Leroy Johnson grew up in Revere. His nephew, Danny Nordside, sent a photo, and Roman Susel from Czechoslovakia sent me the crew photo. I couldn't believe it. He had been doing extensive research on this particular bomb wing, and he had it was amazing that we ever connected, so I was able to actually get a crew photo of Leroy Johnson. He was with a group that was bombing a Czechoslovakian oil refinery flying out of Italy. And their planes, there were 7 planes in the squadron. They were attacked by 90 German planes. And the entire squadron was destroyed except one man, the navigator out of Leroy Johnson's plane, parachuted to safety. And he was able to write about it, tell us exactly what happened that day. The military calls it the darkest day, an entire squadron lost. But here you can see that Charles could write about it. He was a prisoner of POW until the end of the war.
And Roman circled a unique 20mm cannon that he thought identified that particular type of aircraft.
And it's interesting that the Germans absolutely forbade the Czechoslovakians from putting fresh flowers on the American graves that were over there. But every morning, the Czech people would put fresh flowers on every grave. They disobeyed the Germans.
We're going to go back up north again to the little town of Gully. I won't even ask if anybody's been there. It's up here in Polk County. So it's right on the edge of the Red River Valley. The town was built in a gully. That's how it was named. It was one of the towns that I had to go back and take pictures of when we were doing our Little Minnesota 100 Towns book, and I would have her dad accompany me on the picture trips, and we would time our visits by the time of the day and what kind of a cafe they had. So the gully was our breakfast stop, a little gully cafe in the old schoolhouse, which was delicious. There's the one Lutheran church in the co-op.
So Captain Oscar Hansen grew up in Gully. He was one of 3 pilots that we had in our little Minnesota World War II book. And he was with the 8th Air Force, and they were stationed in England. And he
flew on D-Day, flew a B-24.
He did, and later flew a B-17. The day that his plane was shot down, they had flown from England to Merseburg, Germany to bomb an oil refinery. Everybody was trying to bomb oil refineries. And just before he left on this mission, he took his 50 mission hat and he threw it to a fellow pilot. And later, the pilot gave that hat to his nephew, Jim Hansen, who lives in Grand Meadow. And so Jim sent us a photo of Oscar's hat, shared the story with us, and also told us that Oscar left a very young wife and 3 small boys. And she was unable to care for the children. So Oscar's brothers adopted the boys. And then last October, the whole family, Clara and the 3 boys, gathered at Fort Snelling for a reburial service for Oscar. So they were all reunited again. And you can see that Oscar is now reunited with his hat also. It's right by his grave.
Yeah, thank God. This is the first time we've had a slide big enough where you can actually see the hat. And such a nice projector. We're going to Danvers in Swift County over by Benson, I guess. Does everybody know where that is? Kind of right up there. And that church, interesting that we've been in Normandy much of the time. That's a Norman-style church. It was designed by a French architect who was a friend of the priest who happened to be serving there. Father O'Neill at the time had been to France. And this was designed by someone named Glyn Chifflet.
Not something you expect to find in Danvers, you know, a town of less than 100 people.
Just amazing.
It is amazing French church.
Our man from Danvers was in the 134th Infantry Regiment, Vincent Dolan.
And a lot of men in our World War II books served with the 35th Infantry Division, the 134th Infantry Regiment. And it was a regiment that traveled all the way through Europe. They kind of went through the whole war up to the Battle of the Bulge.
It shows their path. They started on D-Day, ended up as an occupation army. So they really did their job. There's a story that was recently told by Wes Gallagher in the Oregonian. And I can't recall the name of the man, but there is a man who was in this company that was involved in something called the Baby Patrol. Has anybody ever heard of that? When they were in Nancy, France, they found that all the people in town had gotten their children out because the Allies were about to retake it and they knew there would be an attack and a counterattack. and they were scared to death. And so they took 81 children and hid them in a chateau in a nearby town called Han, France. Here's a map that shows where Han is. And it was out on a peninsula surrounded by the Selle River, and there was a big open marsh in here across between Han and where the Allies were. And they knew that the Allies wouldn't attack the chateau that they were in, but they were afraid what would happen in the inevitable German counterattack. And so in the dark of night, they got 10 volunteers to go across this open marsh and try to rescue these children. And so they went in, here's the Selle River crossing that they had. This is a recent reunion and kind of a conference that occurred at this place. And there's the chateau, a little stairway and escape door.
But when the 10 men from the 134th Infantry Regiment arrived to get the children, they found 81 children, and most were under the age of 4. So they somehow, 10 men, had to get these 81 kids across an open marsh in a river.
They grabbed a baby under each arm,
Put them on their
kids
backs,
on their back,
and told the kids, you cannot make a sound. You can't.
and they crept
didn't.
across the marsh. And then about halfway across, the Germans spotted some movement and just opened up with artillery and everything else, but they missed. They didn't hurt anybody. They all made it back safely.
Quite a story. But this, it's all these stories that have happened that nobody ever hears about because it was just like a common day occurrence. It was just heroism. Constantly, these men were doing something amazing.
After that, he was involved in things that happened after December 16th, 1944. Anybody know
What happened?
what's significant about that date?
December 16th, 1944.
It was the Battle of the Bulge. That's when Germany struck back and tried to push through with their Operation Nordwind. There's a couple of photos from that time. There's the Ardennes Forest. There's the 134th carrying some wounded at Lutterbach. And here's a picture of Bastogne, Belgium. Over Christmas, the 101st Parachute Infantry Regiment, which came in as an infantry, not a parachute, was guarding the road here in Bastogne, and they were encircled. Has anybody heard the story of when the Germans tried to make them surrender?
Yes.
You heard that? Yeah. A German party came with a white flag and said, "You're surrounded, it's hopeless, we're going to destroy you. We think you should surrender and save your lives, and you'll be okay in our camps." And General McAuliffe wrote a reply to him and handed it to him, and he opened it up and said, "Nuts, nuts." What does that mean? And one of the colonels said, "It means go to hell." Oh. So they got the drift, and somehow the people at Bastogne held out. This is an actual foxhole from that time in the Ardennes Forest near Bastogne. This probably was part of the movie Band of Brothers, or something like it. That's where it was set. And this is a little area right around there. You can see these little tiny stick crosses that people have made. And there's a lot of monuments over there, but there was nothing more touching than just to see this little thing out in the middle of the forest.
Now we're going to Ireland, and everybody seems to know where Ireland is. You've all been to Ireland.
Just for the audience, they're down in the corner.
Truman Melling grew up in Ireland, and he too was a screaming eagle. He was in the 101st Airborne, but he was in Bastogne in the Battle of the Bulge, but he was a gliderman. Have anybody heard of a gliderman or gliders before?
Yes.
You have, okay.
We had some people that said, "Oh, the Fagan Museum up by Granite Falls has got a glider in their museum." So
I want to see it.
we've been told we have to go there, and it sounds like everyone should go there to see this. The glider was, you can see the tow, I think that's a
Yes,
tow
it
line right
is.
there. And they're towed by a C-47, and then they would come in silently. They're designed to come in at night in secret behind enemy lines, and they were designed for the D-Day landings at Normandy. A number of them participated. Truman didn't. He ended up in the infantry like some of them did and was on Utah Beach. Here's what the inside of a glider looks like with the 11 men in there. And they're made out of a metal frame with canvas, about as sturdy as a Cessna 150, if you've ever been in one of those. And they were really designed for a controlled landing. They often ended up crashing, and you hope that people survive. Here's a picture of a glider landing in a Normandy field between all these hedgerows and tiny little fields. And then Germans put up poles all over the field to try to impede the landing further. They called that Rommel's asparagus. So that wasn't a very pleasant way to fly, but he did land successfully a glider in Operation Market Garden, came in as infantry to Bastogne, and that's where he met his end.
Some other men who served from southwestern Minnesota. There's two men from Wilder, if you know where Wilder is, in Jackson County, Laverne Nelson and Myra Lundgren grew up next door to one another. And Muriel Nelson told me the story of how her brother Laverne and Myra would play together over the years. And then Wilbur Wright was from Kinbray. Anybody know where Kinbray is? Oh, you do? Okay.
I think they count up 16 if they
Yeah.
still have it.
Maybe 12 now.
Former home of the Kinbray Steakhouse. I don't know if they found a new owner yet.
And Wilbur was with the 82nd Airborne. He was also a paratrooper, and his niece, Margaret Gertzima, was wonderful to send information. I couldn't have done his story without her help. You guys were at the end. Can you hang in there for a few more minutes?
When in Band of Brothers, one of the comments that they made when they got into the concentration camps and liberated them, the men said, "Well, now we know why we're here." And we heard that quote from others.
Yes.
Yeah. Here's some Polish prisoners that have been liberated from the Holocaust Museum photo.
And we did have some men in the book that were a part of a regiment or a company that helped to liberate the prisoners. And Edward Thompson from Nassau, he was involved with the sub-camp Buchenwald. Elmer Kittleson from Strangfist again was involved with Dachau, and Ira Asher with Landsberg in Halpering. And while we were over last summer on our Band of Brothers tour, we visited the sub-camp at Halpering to see what it was like, and there it was.
This was a work camp. This is a little mound. You can see that mound over there. They covered up their little workstations, which held about 40 prisoners. And they would make parts for airplanes or concrete blocks or whatever in these work camps. It was not a camp where they deliberately killed people, although you could say they worked them to death because they had inadequate food and water and everything, basically. When these were liberated after that, they left a memorial to the 103rd Cactus Division that happened to liberate this particular camp. And in 5 languages, it says, "Never again." So it's a memorial to those men and kind of symbolic of all of the things that happened.
So we're going to end with Herman Thielander from Kinbray.
There's Kinbray.
He was in the Navy. The war is over. It's December 5th, 1945. And Herman is at the Naval Station in Fort Lauderdale, awaiting for his discharge papers. And on December 5th, he is sent out on a training flight. And there are 5 planes that are sent out on this training flight. Well, after a few hours, the control tower gets a message from the pilot, and he says, I'm lost. I don't know where I am. I feel like I'm turned around. I can't tell where I'm going. And then dead silence. So none of the 5 planes from Flight 19 returned back to the naval station. So they sent a 6th plane out to look for the planes, and they never returned. So that day, 6 planes and 27 men were lost, and they have never been found to this day. And there are people that have devoted their lives to searching for these planes, and you'll see it on TV once in a while. They'll have a big special on Flight 19. They're still looking for it.
So they flew out of Fort Lauderdale. They were supposed to go here, where they went, and then they were supposed to cross Bermuda, get up to this point, and then come back. And somewhere in here, in the Bermuda Triangle, they got mixed up. So some people would like to attribute it to mysterious forces, but of course they have a lot of bad weather in there, and they encountered bad weather. It's from what people can discern from this report on their IDPF, they seem to have seen Bermuda or one of these islands, and they thought they got so turned around they thought they were all the way down in Florida Keys. And so to get to Fort Lauderdale, they went that way, which means they ended up somewhere out there. But even that one boat that's been looking for them for over 30 years with advanced ultrasound and advanced information hasn't been able to find them. So it's one of those unsolved mysteries.
You know, the book was really fascinating to write, but it was also really difficult because as we wrote it and got to know the families and felt like we got to know the men, it just became so real to us. And we couldn't help but think of what wonderful contributions the men would have made to the world had they survived the war. Some of them were amazing writers and poets, teachers, architects, farmers, and but probably most importantly, they were brothers, they were sons, they were friends, and in some cases they were husbands and fathers. And their families really want what we all want. They want their loved ones to be remembered. And so the purpose of our book is that we will remember these very small number of men, but 140 men will be remembered. And please, if you have stories, if you have a loved one that's been in World War II or any war, write their story, because once we're gone, I don't know if other people will be interested in doing it. So thank you for coming and for sharing this time with us.
Yeah.
Are you going to be here a little bit longer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I need to run home because I got some stuff at home you might be interested in.
Oh, great. Okay.
Our talk ends on Zell am See in Austria, and this is near Berchtesgaden, where they captured Hitler's eagle's nest as one of the final acts of the war. Official work. So, it's a little lake in Austria, up in the Alps, called Zell am See. It's by a ski resort, and it's near a town called Berchtesgaden. Just above Berchtesgaden was Hitler's eagle's nest. It was a retreat that he built into the mountain that was impenetrable. And he had to ride a 40-story elevator to get up there. He never spent a night up there because he was scared to death of heights. So, I understand that Ava Braun, his mistress, spent a lot of time up there, probably because she knew he would come up there.
So if you have any questions or comments,
Well, I missed a little detailed information so that Flight 19,
Yeah.
the person that we're talking about that died when his flight went out was from Kinder?
He was from Kinder.
Kinder, okay.
Yeah, feeling. I'll go back. There he is.
they're all just so very young, aren't they? I mean, you look at these faces and, I mean, I think he was 18 or 19, but he looks a lot younger.
I lost a bit of information on the slide, but he was in the U.S. Naval Reserve. and based out of Fort Lauderdale.
Found a nephew, Dennis Zerke, who was able to send photos and give us some information. He had a sister who was deceased, and she didn't have any children, so then you have to really look, for a cousin or a niece or a nephew or whatever. And luckily, we were able to find a lot of nieces and nephews. That was one.
Yeah, there's his.
I thought Kinbray was such a pretty town, and I kind of wanted it for the cover of our towns book, but the publisher, no, we're not going to do Kinbray. They wanted Minneska,
Yeah.
which was, they felt a little bit more scenic, but I thought Kinbray was so pretty.
With the time span of time that it took you to do all the research and write the book, how many years did it take?
About 6
For this book.
for this book. The first book was, I suppose,
7.
7. And then when we wrote the towns book, we had done a little bit of research for the World War II men because it was just so,
Things were starting to pile up. I mean, she kept finding
I
man
thought,
after man.
how on
but-
earth is it possible that a town with 100 people can lose 8 men in World War II? This is crazy. And that really sparked our interest in finding out their stories and what happened.
And what was the first book called?
The first book is Little Minnesota 100 Towns, and this is the smallest towns in Minnesota, like Kinbray, with 12 people. And the very smallest town is Funkley, which has 5 people. But they have a council, so if you're standing up and breathing in Funkley, guess what? You're on the council.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And that's why all the men in the World War II book are from the tiniest towns.
We drove through Florence today,
Yeah.
which is a very tiny town, and there's really no businesses there anymore. They used to have a post office, I think. Now all they have is a park. But we talked to someone in one of the little towns, and we said, well, why do people live here? And he said, well, it's our home, and it's like a little neighborhood. It's an isolated neighborhood. It might be 7 miles away from the next neighborhood. That was.
But one mayor, I think it was the mayor of Barry, population
it was Barry.
16. I said, what? Why do you live here? He said, it's quiet. It's quiet. Well, okay.
Thank you.
So thanks so much. We do have books if you're interested. Appreciate your coming and your interest in World War II. And the families appreciate it too.
It's fun to have a small group because then we can
Yeah.
have more of them.
If it's a real big group, it's harder. People are not as likely to speak out or say anything or share a story. And I'm sure all of you have probably had somebody that served in World War II or an uncle or a grandparent or whatever. Am I right? Have you had an uncle, and where was he?
He's on a ship. He's killed in
He was.
my dad was president.
And do you know where he was killed?
I do not know.
Yeah. Gotta write a story. Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know enough about him to be able to. I read some of my mom's letters that he had written to her.
So she kept his
She
letters?
did, but I know my other brother lived in the house, but I don't know where they're at.
Yeah.
And he was there.
They're
Yeah.
probably up in the attic.
And we
I
heard,
hope. Maybe not.
we heard that from several families. They just didn't know what happened to anything. The families scattered after the war. Some moved to California, some moved wherever, and they lost track of the photos and the papers and everything. So it's just really important to write these stories down. Anybody else have anybody in World War II or? No?
Jill had a bunch of uncles.
I did, yeah. I grew up hearing World War II
I had a
stories
couple.
from my dad,
Yeah.
who wasn't in World War II, but he had brothers and brother-in-laws and, who miraculously all survived.
I have 2 uncles up in the Pacific that
Yeah.
survived.
They are 18, and that includes tax.
There are some refreshments for anyone who would like some, and a small survey if you wanted to tell us how you enjoyed this program.
Well, thank you, I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I'm glad you